Hi everyone, this is Elia, and welcome to the free homeopathy series, session 2. Uh, During tonight's session, we're going to focus on the study of Materia Medica and delve a little bit into comparative Materia Medica study, and we're going to pick up on this session next month with a further study of Materia Medica, especially focusing on comparative Materia Medica. So let's go ahead and get started. These are the various items that we're going to be reviewing during this course. We've discussed this during the first session. I won't review them again. And I wanted to start tonight's session by talking a little bit about Adolph Lippe. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this very well-known, very famous homeopath who some people consider to have been the greatest prescriber of all time. Yes, greater than Hahnemann, greater than Kent, greater than Farrington, greater than Berridge, greater than Phineas Parkhurst Wells, greater than even the great Constantine Hering. He was called the Ajax of homeopathy because he would drive into battle, and like that great Greek general, he would defeat all his foes. And I've probably shared this before with you, but during 50 years of busy practice, uh, very, very busy practice, Lippe never lost one typhoid, cholera, or malaria patient. 50 years of busy practice. And again, this is during a period of time when the mortality rate of these various diseases is very high, anywhere from 40 to 50 to even 60%. So an incredibly mercurial, brilliant prescriber. And Eugene Boharris Nash, who you can see here on the left-hand side, tells this very interesting story of a man who's dying of cholera. And there are a number of homeopaths in attendance, all trying to treat the individual, but unsuccessfully. And so they're basically giving up, and they decide to call for the assistance of the master Lippe. And so they send a messenger, and perhaps 20, 24 hours later, Lippe shows up at the door, and he simply puts his foot into the door, hears the man's breathing, and from the man's breathing, he knows that the remedy that is indicated is Zincum metallicum. And he says, quick, give him Zincum metallicum. And of course, everyone else in attendance is astounded. How can this master practitioner know what remedy to give simply by listening to the breathing of the patient? But they trust the master Lippe, so they give a dose of Zincum, and within a few hours, the symptoms begin to subside, and 24 hours later, he is asymptomatic. It's an amazing story, and sometimes people think it demonstrates the evidence that Lippe was somehow an intuitive prescriber. But this is not really the case. If you actually look at how Lippe studied the Materia Medica and how he looked at his cases in the early years, you know that he basically compared many, many remedies that would come up in analysis, comparing one against the other, so that he knew what were the similarities and differences between the remedies which were comparable in action and which would have to be considered in any type of comparative analysis. So it wasn't just an intuitive ability, or really it wasn't an intuitive ability at all. It was really this very intensive study of our remedies, of our Materia Medica, that allowed Lippe to almost look like he was carrying on a magic act by walking into a room and knowing the remedy that was indicated for the patients. Constantine Hering is another example of one of our stalwart practitioners who had incredible success. Hering treated hundreds of cases of pneumonia and never lost one patient. And again, this is during a period of time when the mortality rate of these diseases, of pneumonia, for example, was 30, 40, 50, even 60%. And yet he never lost a patient. Now, I love this photograph here. You can see this is a picture that shows Constantine Hering in his study just before his death. I think we can assume, or at least we could perhaps guess, that the remedy he required was sulfur. You can see the tables cluttered with the manuscripts of his work. Then the apparatus over the desk was an oil lamp with an attachment which allowed him to regulate it without getting up, which would be exactly what a sulfur patient might be interested in doing, is being able to have all these books, all this knowledge, all this scattered information all around him, but not really wanting to have to get up and deal with some type of mundane matter such as regulating his oil lamp. There's also a quote that kind of goes with this photograph, and the quote says, "I will have to take a day off, stay at home, and put things right in my study. I have made a beginning this morning. No one else can see the change, but I know there is one. Hering, for those of you who are not familiar with his writings, was a very humorous individual, and there are many, many funny stories about things that he did during his lifetime. It's incredible. If you really want to learn more about him, you might want to read Ner's biography of Hering. Ner was the son-in-law of Hering, and he knew him intimately and had incredible stories to share. Now, Hering may have been a sulfur, maybe not, but he wasn't really a lazy individual. He was an incredible practitioner, and there's this great quote that he wrote where he said, this is after he had discovered homeopathy. He wrote that my enthusiasm grew. I became a fanatic. I went about the country, visited inns, where I got up on tables and benches to harangue whoever might be present to listen to my enthusiastic speeches on homeopathy. I told the people that they were in the hands of cutthroats and murderers. Success came everywhere. I almost thought I could raise the dead. And then we have this wonderful quote by Calvin B. Nair, who summed up Hering's personality by writing that I began to suffer under the strain of trying to keep up with the man of iron constitution, who never seemed to tire or to need time for rest or relaxation. So although he may have been a kind of a somewhat indolent sulfur, he was an incredibly laborious, arduous, hard worker, an enthusiastic individual with very high principles who accomplished a tremendous amount for homeopathy. Even if we just looked at his proving, and especially his proving of lachesis, he would be one of the great benefactors to our great science and art. Now, in 1848, Constantine Hering, along with Jacob Jeans and Walter Williamson, established what is referred to as the Homeopathic Medical College of Pennsylvania. And this is one of the very early institutions teaching homeopathy in the United States. Actually, the original classes were actually taught in German. Many of the original homeopaths and students were actually German speakers. And in 1864, so this is starts in 1848, so about 18 years later, in 1864, through a number of different machinations which occurred, Adolph Lippe actually became the president of the Homeopathic Medical College of Pennsylvania, and he and Hering had a falling out, and actually Hering left in 1867. The reason that this is important is that Lippe was a very staunch, very conservative individual relative to how homeopathy should be taught, and he felt that everything, all the science classes, the pathology, the anatomy, everything should be taught from the perspective of the founder's teachings, from the perspective of the Organon and Hahnemann's other associated writings. And so he instituted from 1864 through 1869 this very rigorous program of teaching the Organon and adhering very closely to the principles that are found in the Organon and in chronic diseases and in other writings by Hahnemann. And the reason this is so significant is that if you look at the practitioners who graduated during this 5-year period, they were the greatest, or amongst the greatest homeopaths who ever lived. We have the documented record of the success rate of these particular practitioners, and they were amazingly successful. It is true that if you look at the documented record, that when people digress or diverge or move away from the principles as described in the Organon der Heilkunst, that their success level will go down. As to the degree that they adhere to the principles found in the Organon, you will see that their success rate is maintained and they achieve miraculous and wonderful cures. Now, why am I bringing all this up? Because Lippe actually studied with Hering, and he learned a particular method of Materia Medica study, which allowed him to be able to walk into the room of a patient and within a matter of moments, maybe not in all cases, but at least in some cases, in a matter of moments, to know the remedy that was indicated for that particular patient. And we're going to focus today on this very seminal work of Hering, which is called the diagnostic method, and is the approach that Lippe and many of the other old-time homeopaths used to master their knowledge of Materia Medica study. Unfortunately, this approach has largely been forgotten today, and we use kind of shortcut approaches which don't have the level of depth of understanding, and as consequently we aren't able to practice homeopathy as effectively as these old-time practitioners were. So let's talk a little bit about the study of Materia Medica. Here you can see Timothy Field Allen's 12-volume encyclopedia, Pure Materia Medica. Obviously, trying to just read this from cover to cover will be a very difficult enterprise, and most of us will probably fall short of ever being able to do that. I personally don't know anybody who's ever attempted to read it from cover to cover. The truth of the matter is, if you do so, you really know very little about homeopathy because it's a little laundry list of symptoms, and when you finish reading one remedy and move on to the next, you really don't have any sense of what's going on and what is the differences and similarities between one remedy and another. So we need some type of approach, some type of method that allows us to make sense of this great body of information without compromising our ability to understand homeopathy at the deepest level. Now, let's start with Clemens von Bönninghausen. And I want to read, this is from Bönninghausen's Lesser Writings, and it has to do with a congress that was held in Brussels shortly after Hahnemann's death. And Bönninghausen writes, "It is now over 3 years since the great homeopathic congress was held in Brussels. I am sorry to say, but Belgium being, I am sorry to say, but little represented. In the last session of this meeting, after several propositions had been read, my resolution was adopted, and a prize question was proposed, to answer which a period of 2 years was granted. This prize essay, as the homeopathic journals have also made known, was intended to call out a treatise concerning the greater or lesser characteristic value of the symptoms occurring in a disease, to aid as a norm or basis in the therapeutical selection of the remedy." The answer to this question, in other words, he's saying he offered a contest. He invited his colleagues to write in and to try to describe what comprises these characteristic symptoms. Because Hahnemann talks about it in Aphorism 153 of the Organon, the more striking, strange characteristic signs and symptoms of the disease, but he doesn't really elaborate in any great detail what these actually are. How do we understand them? What can we qualify what this actually means? He just says that we're looking for these characteristic symptoms, but he doesn't really clarify exactly what this comprises. And so Bönninghausen basically has this little contest, and he offers a prize. And to continue, he writes, "The answer to this question was not limited to Belgium or to France, but it was handed over to the competition of the whole medical world, and it was thus unanimously acknowledged to be a subject of the greatest importance. Nevertheless, this question, in spite of the daily increase in the homeopathic literature, has thus far remained unsolved." In other words, nobody writes in. This silence, extending far over the time set, which was computed liberally enough, seems to justify the assumption that the solution of the question has met with considerable difficulties, though every homeopath must every moment find himself in the position to ask himself this question and to have to answer it. It might not appear altogether proper for me, the author of the question, to also now enter among the competition for this prize, but the old practitioner will be pardoned for furnishing at least some contribution to the solution, and thereby again calling attention to the question. So in other words, he puts forth this prize. He says, write in, what do you think constitutes a characteristic type of symptom? How can we fully understand this? Nobody writes in, and he says, okay, look, none of you guys wrote in. I gave you lots of time to answer the question. Nobody did so. So let me offer my answer to this question in terms of what actually comprises these characteristic symptoms. And from this, he offered this, what we call Latin hexameter. And basically, this Latin hexameter has 7 parts. So we've got the quis, which is the personality of the patient, the who is the patient in front of me. The quid is the peculiarity of the complaints, what is actually happening. So the who is a 37-year-old irritable man. The quid is the what, he's got a migraine headache. The ubi is the location, the seat of the disease. So perhaps it starts in his occiput and moves up to the vertex. The quibus auxilis is the concomitant symptoms, those symptoms which seem to arise in conjunction with the main complaint. The cure is the why, what caused this particular problem. Was it a blow to the head, or perhaps he had sunstroke, or he got into a fight with his intimate partner? The Komodo is the modalities. I'm sorry, that's actually Komodo is the modalities of circumstances, and the Quando is the modality of time. So that's incorrect there. The Komodo is the modalities, what makes it better or worse, and the Quando is the modality of time. It was better at 4 a.m. and worse at 6 p.m. So this is where we derive location, sensation, modalities, and concomitants. This is the actual origin of this. And if you think about it, this is exactly what you need to know when you're studying a case. You need to know all of this information. But you also need to know it when you're looking at approving, when you're studying approving, and you also need to know this when you study Materia Medica. This is exactly the type of information that you want to understand about a remedy. You want to know what type of person this remedy is going to be indicated, what type of conditions are it's going to be called in for, where will the locations of these symptoms be, what other concomitant symptoms arise, and why does this particular remedy, what causes the state? Is it natrum sulfuricum where it's a blow to the head, or is it natrum carbonicum where it's sunstroke? And you'll also want to know things like the modalities of both circumstance and also of time. So this is a very useful little description of the type of information that we want in our patients, in our provings, and in our Materia Medica. Now, Hering wrote this very seminal article on the study of Materia Medica, and his advice was that we have to create a framework for studying remedies by comparison. Why by comparison? Well, if you think about it, the reason we want to study remedies by comparison, there's a few different reasons, but one primary reason is that we want to understand how these remedies are similar and how they're different. But also, if you think about what we do in case analysis, we repertorize a case, we've got a list of remedies, and then we compare the remedies next to each other to see how they're different, how they're similar, and which one best fits the totality of characteristic symptoms in our case. Well, if we study remedies by comparison, then we will be adapted to and acclimated to the process of case analysis. So studying remedies in comparison will facilitate and make the process of actual case analysis much, much easier for us. Hering recommended that we look for the characteristic symptoms, those are the examples that we saw earlier in the Latin hexameter, whether there are mental symptoms, a peculiar kind of pain, the direction in which the pain appears, the conditions of their aggravation and amelioration, also peculiar concomitant symptoms that arise at the same time as the main complaint. He also suggested that we look at the periodicity of symptoms, the time of day when the symptoms appear, etc., etc. So this is basically what Hering is describing in his very seminal article on the study of Materia Medica. And what I'd like to do now is read some passages. I'm not going to read the whole article. If you'd like to read the whole article, which I highly recommend, you can go to the Whole Health Now website. Oh, I did not pull it up, so I will do that right now. You can go to the Whole Health Now website, and if you go there, under professional info, right over here, this tab, professional info, you click, and you will see professional articles over here. And under professional articles, there's a number of articles, and we'll find one here. There's actually one by Carol Dunham on the study of Materia Medica. We're going to delve into that one next week. But then right below that, there's one here called The Study of Materia Medica by Constantine Hering, and you can click on this little link here, and it's going to go ahead and open up that article for you. And we actually retranslated this because we felt that the English translation had some deficiencies, so we actually retranslated this. So I believe this is the best English translation. So go ahead and when you have a chance, go ahead and read through this, and I think you'll get even a deeper understanding of the study of Materia Medica as described by Constantine Hering. Now, I'm not going to read the whole article, as I said, and I've actually even taken certain segments out from this article and they're not in the same order that you'll find them in the original article. I've kind of reorganized the information to serve the purposes of what I'm trying to convey for tonight's presentation. So again, you won't find this exact in this order. I've extracted certain pieces out from the article. We're going to go ahead and read through them, and then I'm going to explain a little bit more detail and then also show you some practical ways of actually using homeopathic software to apply the method that Hering is describing. So Hering starts by saying, learning the Materia Medica off by heart would be a highly absurd plan, and not only impossible on account of the extent of the undertaking, but even if possible, utterly useless. In order to acquire a foreign language, what good would it do to learn the dictionary from beginning to end? And this is a very good point that Hering makes. How many people have ever tried to learn a new language by opening up a dictionary for that language and starting with maybe the word aardwolf or aardvark or something along those lines, and then just reading the definition and moving through? That would be a relatively futile effort and would not really teach you anything about that language. It's not how people actually learn language. They learn it in terms of pattern recognition. And so this is obviously not the way that we need to study Materia Medica. We can't simply start by going through a list of symptoms and trying to memorize them. It will be a completely useless endeavor to make such an attempt. Continuing, Hering writes, one who could repeat the list of symptoms of a remedy in their regular order, again reading the dictionary from beginning to end, would not thereby possessing knowledge of the combination of symptoms. And that it is which we stand in need of, the combination of symptoms. In practice, we never make use of the whole range of symptoms, but always only of particular combinations of a small portion of them. And this is very, very important, that it's actually the combination of symptoms, not as a list, but the combinations related to each other. That's what is going to be important in our understanding of our remedies. Hahnemann reflects this idea when he constantly talks about the complex of symptoms. If you read through the organon, when he refers to symptoms, he will very often use the word complex of symptoms. In other words, not symptoms floating around in empty space, separate and isolated from each other, but somehow related to each other in some manner that forms some type of larger idea or picture, some type of image that we can understand as it relates to that remedy. Continuing in this article, Hering writes, although the physician at the bedside of the patient has ever so carefully compared a medicine with the case before him, yet this can tend but little to advance his knowledge of it, and cannot be termed a study of the medicine, as it is only viewed in connection with the case thus before him. To study a remedial agent is to observe attentively its symptoms and curative powers without any reference to particular cases or particular diseases, to consider all its effects as connected with one another, all its individual symptoms as separate parts of a whole. Now there's two things here which are very important that Hering is conveying. The first thing is that we cannot learn Materia Medica, we cannot learn our remedies by simply and only studying cases. As a matter of fact, Hahnemann was extremely reluctant to publish cases for exactly this reason. He felt that if he published a case of, for example, chamomilla that had a certain listing of myriad of symptoms or that was associated with a certain condition, that his followers might assume that every case of chamomilla would have that condition or would have those exact set of symptoms. And so he didn't want people to be confused into thinking that this case of this remedy would be the only way that that remedy would present in all future cases that you might see where that remedy was indicated. So Hahnemann was very reluctant and actually only published a very few cases in his lifetime, and only really after his followers were very persistent about him doing so. And of course, this was with qualification that we have to be careful not to assume that every case of that remedy will appear in the same way. Now, this is interesting because today, at most conferences, there is a great emphasis on cases. And you'll see that many times our teachers will not actually teach so much materia medica, but will actually teach a case, and then you'll learn that a certain remedy was indicated, and the assumption is made that by studying the case, you understand the remedy. Uh, that is really not the case. We have to study remedies independent of our cases. It's not to say that studying cases doesn't have value to it. It does have value, provided that you understand that not every case of the remedy will appear in the same way. And also, if you can study many different cases where the same remedy was indicated, and you can see all of the different facets or manifestations by which a remedy can present in clinical practice, then we will have a much broader understanding. If we only study one case associated with a remedy, it may lead us astray. The second point that Hering is making in this passage is that the individual symptoms are somehow related, are connected to each other, and that the separate parts form a whole. And this is very important. We really have to understand that we have to use our brain in such a way that we can stand back from the symptoms and perceive or understand them not as disparate individual floating objects in a Newtonian reductionistic type of empty space, but that there is actually a pattern or relationship of symptoms which forms some larger whole. And we have to understand how to perceive that whole in our study of materia medica, in our study of provings, and in our analysis of our patients' cases. This is very, very significant. I'll give you a few little tricks and tips a little bit later on how you can develop your brain in such a way that you're better able to perceive this whole in your patients, in the materia medica, and in our provings. Continuing, Hering writes that the proper mode of studying the whole materia medica consists in making oneself completely master of a few medicines, and afterwards of those most nearly connected with them, and so on, always comparing the new ones with those first studied. On this account, I call this the diagnostic method. So this is the name that he gives to this particular method of materia medica study. He calls it the diagnostic method. And he says, after one or more families of nearly related substances have thus been worked out, the others follow much more easily. So in other words, you master a few small number of medicines, you learn those really well, and then you look for those medicines which are, and I'll explain what he means by nearly connected with them, those that are very nearly connected, that are somehow similar, and then you compare the new ones with those first studied. And he's saying this is the study of materia medica which is most effective. And this is the approach which he calls the diagnostic method. And he says that when you do this, the other remedies that are studied later on follow much more easily. He says, continuing, that he who seeks to study the medicines according to their symptoms, but each medicine separately, and without instituting a comparison between them, if you just study them by themselves, without comparing the remedies one to the other, will, with the very best memory, not advance far before forgetting what he had previously learned. In other words, and this is what I was talking about earlier with Timothy Field Allen's Encyclopedia of Pure Materia Medica. If you read through that laundry list of symptoms associated with sulfur, and then you move on to calcarea, and then you move on to lycopodium, no matter how good your memory is, even if you have the memory of a Benjamin Franklin, you're still not going to advance very far, because it's just going to become all this big confused mess, and you're going to forget what you previously learned, and it's going to get jumbled up with what you just studied. He then says, and this is what's important, the memory is incapable of retaining anything but what is presented to it in connection with something else. An idea is easily brought to the recollection only when in connection with others. In other words, we can only remember things when we compare one thing with another thing. Let me give you an example of this. We have a case here of black vomit with putrid involuntary stools, with much thirst, restlessness, black tongue, and great debility. Black vomit, putrid involuntary stools, much thirst, restlessness, black tongue, and great debility. Now, if you know your polycrest remedies fairly well, most of you will read this and say, oh, this sounds very much like the remedy Arsenicum album. And you would be absolutely correct. What I just read sounds very much like the remedy Arsenicum album. So, why? Black vomit, putrid involuntary stools, much thirst, restlessness, black tongue, and great debility. All of those symptoms fit very nicely in the context of that remedy. But if I add to this list of symptoms averse to being covered, then we can no longer think about the remedy Arsenicum album. Arsenicum album is a remedy which tends to be quite chilly and wants to be covered. Now, they don't want their head covered. They have a hot head and a cold body, but generally speaking, they want to be covered up, with the exception of their head, which they like to have cold or cool air or fresh air on. Okay? But if I say averse to being covered, then you really are going to not be thinking about Arsenicum album. Actually, averse to being covered would be what we refer to as a Gegen symptom, a contrary symptom to the prescription of that remedy, something that goes against that prescription. This is what Heiner Frey refers to as a polarity symptom. Okay, something that works against the indication or prescription of this particular remedy. Again, because Arsenicum is such a chilly remedy. So when I add averse to being covered, this is no longer Arsenicum album. It's actually now the remedy Secale cornutum. Secale is that fungus which grows on rye, which the witches used to eat and have kind of these psychotropic experiences, these hallucinogenic experiences. And it's from where Albert Hofmann actually derived LSD-25, lysergic acid diethyl tartrate, was derived from ergot. He was working with ergot methylates for various purposes, and he accidentally came across LSD-25, accidentally ingested some, and had a psychedelic, psychotropic experience. The witches knew about this long before, and they would actually consume this little fungus that would grow on the rye, and they would have these psychotropic experiences. Now, the reason this is interesting is because it would now be very easy to remember Secale as the remedy which shared all these symptoms with Arsenicum: the black vomit, the putrid involuntary stools, the much thirst, the restlessness, the black tongue, and the great debility. But it has, instead of being chilly and wanting to be covered, has an aversion to being covered. And you can see that if you just tried to memorize those symptoms without relating them to Arsenicum, it would be much more difficult than remembering that Secale is that remedy that shares this grouping of symptoms with Arsenicum, but instead of being chilly and wanting to be covered, is hot and wants to be uncovered. And you can see the value here of studying one thing in relationship to another. Hering continues in his Study of Materia Medica article by saying that there are certainly two other possible methods other than the diagnostic method. Okay, and he says one is to learn what are called the principal symptoms of each medicine. So in other words, you open up Henry Clay Allen's Keynotes and Characteristics of the Materia Medica, or Lippe's Red Line Symptoms, or Morrison's Desktop Guide, or any of the other keynote books that we have there, and you go through and you memorize the really, really important keynote symptoms of any particular remedy. Now, I'm not saying that this doesn't have value to it. It does have some value, but let's see what Hering says. He says one is to learn what are called the principal symptoms of each medicine, the keynotes. The other is to study each substance by itself, and thus all of them unconnectedly. We saw earlier that he's already critical of studying things by themselves and not in comparison with others. And then a fourth method is to not study the Materia Medica at all. Obviously, we can imagine where that would get us, not studying at all. There are practitioners out there who advocate such an approach, but I think for success in practice, it will be difficult to achieve any type of consistency if you don't know anything about our remedies. He then continues by writing that to learn the so-called principal symptoms, e.g., to extract from an epitome like Yar's manual the most prominently marked sentences, and to get these off by heart, is the shortest way to practice. So you say, okay, yeah, you can go and study the keynotes, and that might be a quick way to just get in there and start, prescribing, and at least you know what's, really, really important for any of these. But then he says, but at the same time, it is the surest way to permanent mediocrity. Let him who is forced to make a trade of his profession adopt this method. It will bring him soonest into the center of the woods. So you'll be lost in the woods, unable to find your way. You don't have a flashlight, you don't have a compass, you don't have a transistor radio, and you are a goner. You end up starving in the woods because you never really learned the skills that are required to get out of the woods in the first place. And unfortunately, today, many people don't follow the diagnostic method. They just learn the keynotes of our various remedies, and as a result, they don't they don't really master Materia Medica, and they have a certain level of mediocrity relative to the understanding of our remedies. And they certainly wouldn't be able to do what Lippe had done, which is to walk into the room and immediately know that the patient needed zincum, or to be able to have a 100% success rate in diseases that have 40 to 60% mortality rates, like Hering did with pneumonia, or Lippe did with typhoid, cholera, and malaria. So if we want to aspire to the greatness of these old-time practitioners, we should look to see what did they do? How did they achieve these amazing results? What was their method? And Lippe, who studied with Hering at the Homeopathic Medical College of Pennsylvania, implemented this diagnostic method. Hering used it himself, and this is one of the reasons they achieved such great success in practice. So, continuing in his seminal article on the study of Materia Medica, Hering writes, the symptoms of a medicine are to be read carefully through several times, from beginning to end in the first years of study, with the pen always in hand. Whilst reading, one thing or other is always to be particularly attended to. And then he says, at first, attention should be directed to the organs in which the symptoms occur. So he says the first thing that you do when you study any remedy is you identify the organs, and let's also add the tissue systems to which this remedy has an affinity. The organ and tissue systems to which this remedy has an affinity. Some people disregard this altogether. They don't think it's important to know which organ and tissue systems a remedy has an affinity for. And yet Hering says it's the first thing that we should understand about our remedies. So, for example, if I told you that a patient came in and they had a lot of bone problems and cardiovascular problems and maybe some problems in the bones of their nose, kind of a syphilitic destructive process in the bones of their nose, and also their mental and emotional state was very much affected, maybe they were suicidal or very depressed, that constellation, those organ and tissue affinities would specifically be focused towards the remedy aurum metallicum. Those are the areas to which aurum metallicum has an affinity. And we can say that this is true for every remedy in our Materia Medica, that there will be certain organ and tissue systems which are prominently affected by that remedy. And this is the first thing that we should really be looking at when we study our Materia Medica. Now let's look at how now he says here that we should use a pen in hand and go through it. Yes, we could do that, of course, but we do have these incredible tools, our homeopathic software programs, which do allow us to go through and actually find this information in a little bit of an easier way. There is no moderator on the call tonight, so if you've got questions, please save those for the very end. If we have time, I'll go through and try to answer as many questions as is possible. So you can write them in now. We have quite a large number of people on the call, but I'll try to address as many questions as is possible. Okay, so let's look at the, we're going to open up software. There's two ways we can do this that I can think of right off the top of my head. Now, one is that there are certain books that have specific organ and tissue affinities listed in the description of the remedies in those books. One is Bosier's Synoptic Key, and another one is the Vermeulen books, specifically the Synoptic books. Will have a very nice description of the organ and tissue affinities. And these are two types of books that I refer to quite frequently in order to discover what are the organ and tissue affinities for any particular remedy. So very easy to do this. I'm now currently in Reference Works, and you can see over here on the left-hand side in the tool palette, there's a little book, and I'm going to simply click on that book. And I've already got a book open, so I'm going to get rid of this. You can see I'm in Vermeulen's Synoptic Reference under the Remedy Valeriana under the General section. I'm just going to click on the book to get rid of that. And now you can see here that I've got a listing of all of the books that are in the Reference Works program. The program can either show a listing of remedies or a listing of books. Right now you can see there's a book in the upper left-hand corner which tells me that I'm going to see all the books that are in the program. If I click on the book, it turns into a remedy, and now I can see a listing of all of the various remedies in the program. Now I want to search through the books, so I'm going to click on the remedy bottle. It turns into a book, and the first book that I mentioned was Bowger's Synoptic Key. So I'm just going to simply type it on my keyboard, B-O-G, B-O-G, and there's Bowger's Synoptic Key. You can see that's now highlighted. If I've got a Windows computer, I can hit Enter on my keyboard. If I've got a Mac computer, I can hit Return. I can do either one of those, and now you can see I'm going to see a listing of all of the remedies that are listed in Bowger's Synoptic Key. I had mentioned earlier Aurum, so let's look at Aurum. I'll type in A-U-R, and here you can see Aurum Metallicum, and I'll go ahead and hit Enter or Return, and now you can see that according to Bowger's Synoptic Key, that this is a remedy that affects the mind, the nerves, the vascular system, the heart, especially on the right side, the bones, especially in the nose, the skull, the bones in the patellae, the joints, the glands, the liver, and the kidneys. And then it will give you some primary modalities, both aggravations and ameliorations. So right here we have a listing of organ and tissue affinities associated with Aurum. If I want to get rid of Bowger's Synoptic Key, I can click on the book Bowger, it disappears. If I now wish to go and see what Vermeulen has to say about Aurum, I could type in V-E-R-M, and now you can see Vermeulen's Concordant Reference, Vermeulen's Synoptic Reference. I'll click on Synoptic Reference, and let's see if we can find Aurum, A-U-R. There's Aurum Metallicum, and I click on that, and now you can see it starts off by giving me a little bit of a description about the substance itself. So it's not Materia Medica, but just general information about gold. And then if we go down a little bit, then you can see here there's a category called affinity, and it tells us that Aurum affects the central and peripheral nervous system, the cardiovascular system, the musculoskeletal system, the liver, and then also the right side is more affected. So between these two books, the Bowger's Synoptic Key and the Vermeulen Synoptic reference books, you will find pretty much a good amount of information about the organ and tissue affinities for all of our different remedies. Now there's another way using homeopathic software that we can find this type of information, and that's to do a type of extraction. So let me just show you that quickly before we move on in the Hering article. So I'm going to go over to McRepertory now, and under the search pull-down menu, there's what we call the concept search. You can either click on search and you can select concepts, or you can type control or command, control for Windows, command for Mac, control or command plus the letter J, and this will bring up what we call the concepts search. And in the concept search, we can search for a remedy in conjunction with certain words. So for example, let's say we want to see if, let's say we want to compare a number of remedies like Hyoscyamus, Belladonna, Stramonium, and Cantharis for urinary complaints, because those four remedies are all remedies that have very similar mental and emotional pictures. Belladonna, Hyoscyamus, Stramonium, and Cantharis vesicatoria are remedies which look very similar in patients who have a kind of a psychotic or schizophrenic type of breakdown, where there's aggravation from water, fear of water, rages, convulsions, attacking, biting, all these things. They can look very, very similar. So what I'm going to do here is under remedies and families, I'm going to type in those four remedies, H-Y-O-S, and then I'm going to hit enter on my keyboard, and then I'm going to type in B-E-L-L for Belladonna. I'm going to hit enter again. I'm going to type in Stramonium, and I'm going to hit enter one more time, and I'm going to type in C-A-N-T-H for Cantharis. And then I'm going to click in the word box here, and I'm going to type in urination. Okay, so I want to see how these remedies relate to urination. And then I'm going to click on search, and it's going to conduct a search. And you can see here are the remedies listed. Let me make these a little bit bigger. If you click on this little button here, you can make this a little bit bigger so we can see these. Okay, and you will notice that for urination, Cantharis comes up much, much stronger than do Stramonium, belladonna, or Hyoscyamus. We can see as it's reflected in the repertory that Cantharis is in many more rubrics associated with urinary problems than is Hyoscyamus, belladonna, and Stramonium. Okay, so right here we can see this. Now let's go ahead and go back to our concept window. I'm going to do that by typing Control or Command J. I'm going to go back here, and I'm going to get rid of, I only want to do one remedy now. So I'm going to click on Clear, okay, and I'm going to choose one remedy. Let's say we chose Valeriana for our last presentation, so I'll just put that one in. It's not a particularly big remedy. So Valeriana, V-A-L-E-R, and I will click on it. I'm not going to put any words in now, and I'm going to click on Search. And now what you see coming up is how Valeriana shows up for various organ and tissue systems in the body. You can see, for example, that it has a very strong effect on the taste, and it has a relatively large effect on the stool, and a relatively large effect on the urine. And I can scroll down this list, and I can see what organ and tissue systems. Here we can see, if you remember from the case that I presented on Valeriana, that it has a very strong effect on fever and perspiration, on the skin. So we can see the different organ and tissue systems that are more prominently affected by Valeriana. So we can do that for locations and of organ and tissue systems. And we can also, if we want, there's a little button here in the bottom left-hand corner with a little head on it. And if we click on that, we actually have all kinds of different parameters that we can use to study a remedy by: aggravations, ameliorations, colors, delusions and fears, emotions, foods that they like or don't like, locations, pains, sensations. Maybe we want to look at sensations. We click there, and we can see, for example, that the jerking sensation is one which is very, very strong in Valeriana relative to these other sensations. We can also see that a constricting sensation is relatively strong. So this is a wonderful tool, very easy to use, and will give you lots of information about the locations, the sensations, the mental and emotional symptoms, and other relative symptomatology for all of the different remedies. And it's something wonderful to explore and to really help us in our study of the different remedies in our Materia Medica. Okay, so let's go back to the Hering article. And again, just to reiterate, the first thing he says is that we should look at the organ and tissue symptoms first. Then continuing, that was the first perusal. He says during a second perusal of the medicine, attention should be directed at the character of the symptoms, for which the former perusal was but a preparation. The character of the pains in different parts should be compared. All pains or other sensations of the same or of a similar or a nearly related kind occurring in different parts should be carefully observed. And again, remember, we can do that here where we see all the different sensations. We could actually go here and look at all the different sensations associated with a particular remedy. Now, one thing that he does make very clear here and further on in this particular article is that sometimes the sensation in one organ or one tissue system will be different than it is in another organ or in another tissue system. In some remedies, we find that the modalities and the sensations tend to be more uniform, but still, we will oftentimes find that, for example, you might have a tearing sensation in the muscles and let's say, a lancinating sensation in the musculoskeletal system. And then you might have a constricting or drawing sensation in the gastrointestinal tract, the alimentary canal. So again, the sensations may vary depending on the organ and or tissue system that we're talking about. And so he's suggesting not just that we look for the sensations, but that we look and see how they might be different in different organ and tissue systems. We're familiar with how the sensations in the stomach will look versus the sensations in the skin or the sensation that we have when they have a headache or whatever else. Okay, now you can see this is a little bit more difficult than just memorizing a bunch of keynotes, but if you do this really well, uh, the actual study of Materia Medica becomes very profound, and it actually becomes easier and easier, and you'll see why that's the case in just a little bit. Okay, so the second thing we do is we go through and we look and we study all of the sensations. He then says that the third reading, the conditions under which the symptoms take place should be noted. Okay, in other words, what are the modalities? What makes these symptoms better or worse? He says it should be observed whether the symptoms take place on the right side or the left, if this has not been previously done, at what part of the day they occur, when our pathological knowledge will be of the greatest assistance, in what attitudes, positions, during what motions, etc., they occur. So the conditions, how do they occur, and what makes them occur? And this is very, very important. These are our modalities. This directly speaks to the susceptibility of the patient. This is why Hahnemann emphasized, as did Bönninghausen, emphasize the importance of modalities. If you remember from session one, the modalities chapter comprises a huge part of the therapeutic pocketbook repertoire because it's a very, very important part in terms of understanding the specific susceptibility of the patient, and this really leads to the best remedy prescription. And you remember, the mind section of the therapeutic pocket repertoire is much, much smaller because, at least in that time, in Hahnemann's day and Bönninghausen's day, the emphasis on mental and emotional symptoms, or at least our understanding of the complexity of mental and emotional states, was not as refined as it is today since the development of the work of people like Freud and Reich and Jung and other modern psychologists and psychiatrists. Then Hering continues by saying that the remedy may be perused yet a fourth time. So the first time was the organ and tissue systems, the second time was the sensations, the third time was the conditions or modalities. He says the fourth time, particular attention should be paid to the combinations of the symptoms. And this is what Hahnemann was saying when he said complex of symptoms, and also what Hering was saying earlier when I read earlier about the combination of symptoms, and that's what we have to pay attention to. So the combination of symptoms, the student observing carefully what symptoms follow each other or occur simultaneously. Now here, this is very important. Hering is introducing the element of time. He's saying not only do we have to understand how these symptoms are related to each other, but we have to understand how they relate to each other in time. That symptoms will follow one another in sequence chronologically, and we want to understand which symptoms come first, and which symptoms come second, and which symptoms come third, and which symptoms come fourth, and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, when Hahnemann prepared his Materia Medica Pura and also chronic diseases, he kind of took apart all the symptoms and he listed them in an organization from basically top down, starting with the mind and then the head and so on and so forth. And in the process of doing this, he kind of broke the symptoms apart. But here you can say that Hering is emphasizing that we have to understand how the symptoms are related to each other in time. And actually, Hahnemann in Aphorism 130 also says the same thing. We'll look at that in just a little bit. Okay, so time is important. We want to understand how they follow each other. We want to understand how does the chill come first, and then the fever, then the perspiration. If they get angry, what follows the anger? What follows the thing that follows the anger, and so on and so forth. And we have to understand this for our remedies if we really want to have a grasp of how they actually present in clinical practice. The person who has most fully elaborated this particular concept, based on the work of people like Bönninghausen and Hering and Hahnemann, is Dr. Paul Herskue in his model called Cycles and Segments. Then continuing, Hering writes, after the moral symptoms had been arranged in groups, again, the moral symptoms have been arranged in groups, not by themselves, but in groups, they may be easily impressed on the memory by comparing them with the corresponding symptoms of other organs. Now, this is strange. Somehow we have to compare the mental symptoms with the symptoms of the organs. What does he mean by this? He says, thus, anxiety, melancholy, etc., are to be compared with the symptoms of the heart and chest. A weak, wandering, or obstinate state of mind with the frequently analogous symptoms of the digestive organs, etc. So what he's saying here is that the symptoms of our patients are related to each other. The mental symptoms are related to the physical symptoms, and that they're related to the organ and tissue systems in which we find those symptoms. That the actual mental emotional symptoms are not more important than the physical symptoms, and that the physical symptoms aren't more important than the mental symptoms, but they are actually an expression of the same mistunement of the patient's life force. Remember, mistunement is the word that Hahnemann used. The German word is Verstimmen, the mistunement of the patient's life force, and that these symptoms are related to each other. So let me just give you a couple of examples. If we look, for example, at the remedy Illumina. Well, the Illumina patient comes in, and oftentimes they're very constipated. And when we ask them, well, when was the last time you had a bowel movement? The Illumina patient will say, well, it's been 3 weeks. 3 weeks? Well, you probably wouldn't say that. You'd say something like, well, that's very interesting. And how do you feel? And they said, well, it doesn't bother me too much. That's a characteristic of Illumina. They're constipated. They're terrible constipation. Sometimes they'll even stick their finger into their rectum to make themselves go. But they don't feel that much bothered by it. Very much like calcarea carbonica also doesn't feel very bothered by being constipated. And when we ask about perspiration, we find that the Illumina patient doesn't perspire very easily and doesn't urinate very easily. And when we ask them questions, they kind of answer like this. And that's constipation of the mind. And so you can see the constipation on the physical plane expressed as an inability to have a bowel movement, lack of sweat, inability to urinate, is also expressed on the mental emotional plane. And we can contrast that with a remedy like Nux vomica, which has this ineffectual urging and straining to stool. They have to go, they can't get it out. Even if they have a bowel movement, they're not satisfied. And isn't that kind of like the mental and emotional state of Nux vomica, where they just don't feel satisfied? They make 2 sales in the morning, they got to make another one in the afternoon. They took over a company in the morning, they got to take out 2 more in the afternoon. They're never constantly. They're struggling, fighting, competing, in traffic jams, screaming at people in front of them. And they have the same type of expression with their bowel movements. They're struggling to get those bowel movements out. Look at the constipation of silica. It's referred to as a bashful stool. It goes out, it comes back in, it's not so sure. And then we see that the personality, the mental emotional state, not personality, but the mental emotional state of the silica patient is one where they also feel bashful. And this is not an accident. We see this similarity running through the mental, emotional, and physical symptoms of all of our remedies. We see cramping for cuprum, and we see a cramped mental and emotional state in the cuprum patient. We see obstinacy in calcarea carbonica. We see constipation in calcarea carbonica. And you will see this expression, this manifestation of similarity in all of the symptoms as they express themselves physically, emotionally, and mentally. Hering continues by saying that after a thorough acquaintance with one or more remedies has been gained in the above manner by doing this comparison, going through this 4 times and a 5th time really by finding the analogous mental and emotional symptoms, when you've done all of this with one or more remedies has been gained in the above manner, the student must then pass on to others. So you do this thorough process, you studied it in this way, and then you go on to others. And he says the best course will be to go on to next to those most nearly allied. So what does he mean by this? Those nearly allied. He says you got to find those remedies which are similar to the ones you've already studied and compare them in relationship with each other. He says when one remedy has been accurately studied and the art has been acquired of classing others along with it according to their resemblance and of distinguishing the differences between them, then each subsequent group that is studied in a similar manner costs far less trouble. The result will be that he who has thus made himself master of 100 medicines will require for the second 100 scarcely so much time and labor as he expended on the first 10. So this is amazing. He's saying, yeah, you got to put a lot of effort at the beginning, a lot of hard work. You got this is not an easy process. Most people want to pick up a keynote book and just memorize the keynotes and Allen or Morrison's desktop guide. Okay, yeah, those have value, no question about it, but that will not lead you to the depth of profundity that the old-time master homeopaths achieved in their understanding of our remedies. That, as he said earlier, you will have a mediocre understanding of Materia Medica. You will never have the depth of knowledge that allows you to practice the way our great masters in the past did. Okay? And then he says, when you do this at the beginning, and you've really learned these first grouping of remedies, the second hundred, you've studied 100, the second 100 will take you the same amount of time as the first 10. So in other words, somehow the process begins to accelerate, just like we see in the calculus, or really in any real process in the universe, entropic or negative entropic, where it's not linear, but actually the process accelerates upon itself. Okay, and this is exactly what happens when we use the diagnostic method of Materia Medica study. It actually becomes easier and easier, and we begin to find where these remedies are grouped and classified in relationship to other remedies. So it's difficult at first, it requires some effort and real labor, but if you're willing to put the time and energy into it, what will happen is it will become easier and easier and easier, and eventually the study of Materia Medica becomes a very facile process, and one that becomes incredibly enjoyable. Continuing, Hering writes, all its individual symptoms are seen as separate parts of a whole. Again, this idea that the individual symptoms have to be seen as separate parts of a whole. The many changes produced in the sensations by its action, which have been separately observed and collected together, are to be regarded as symptoms of one and the same artificial disease. They are seen to belong to one morbid picture. Here on the left you can see a Platonic dialogue called Parmenides. And the Parmenides dialogue specifically deals with this issue of the parts versus the whole. And so I oftentimes recommend to people, if you want to understand this concept at a very deep philosophical level, to study the Parmenides dialogue. The Parmenides dialogue is one of the more difficult of Plato's dialogues. It's a later dialogue, but it's well worth the challenge, and I highly recommend it. It's a brilliant work. Remember, Plato, in terms of Western philosophy, Alfred North Whitehead said that all of Western philosophy is a footnote to Plato. So this is a brilliant understanding of this whole issue of the parts versus the whole. Stuart Close, the author of The Genius of Homeopathy, also reiterated this very essential idea about our remedies when he said that thus every whole exists under the conditions of the combinations of its parts. The combination of its parts creates a dependence of the parts upon each other and upon the specific form of the whole, and the whole exists in reciprocal relations with other forms in the external world. That we are basically living in a holistic universe. Like holism, Holism, was coined by Jan Smuts, who was the leader of South Africa for a period of time during the early 20th century. And he coined this term holism, and it has this idea that there are these individual parts, but they form these larger wholes. And this is also echoed in the Organon in Aphorism 7, where Hahnemann writes that the totality of these symptoms is the outwardly reflected image. Again, this idea of a picture or a painting, an image of the inner vason of the disease. That the symptoms are the outwardly reflected image of this kind of wholeness, this inner vason of the disease, which is greater than the individual parts. It forms something greater than the disparate constituent elements which comprise it. Continuing in The Genius of Homeopathy, Stuart Close writes, Hahnemann calls the totality, this image, which we just read, or picture. The word used is significant and suggestive. A picture is a work of art which appeals to our aesthetic sense as well as to our intellect. Its elements are form, color, light, shade, tone, harmony, and perspective. So it's an image of our remedies that we need to form by studying these very symptoms in combination with each other, as Hering says. In other words, if we draw a face and we put the nose over to the right and the two ears next to each other and the mouth at the top of the head, the parts are there, but they don't form an image that we can understand. And we won't recognize who that person is. We need to have the parts in relationship to each other in such a manner that they form an image that is intelligible to us. Continuing in The Genius of Homeopathy, Stuart Close writes, as a composition, it expresses an idea. It may be of sentiment or fact, but it does this by the harmonious, again, all the parts have to be in the right place, the harmonious combination of its elements into a whole, a totality. In a well-balanced picture, each element is given its full value and its right relation to all the other elements. The elements which must go to make up the totality must be definitely and logically related. And then continuing, he writes, the totality means the sum of the aggregate of the symptoms, not merely the numerical aggregate. You just can't add up the symptoms in a list and think that you understand the image of the remedy, the entire number of the symptoms, but their sum total, their organic whole as an individuality. And this is the most important thing. He says the totality must express an idea. And this is you can see this actually in modern physics in the work of Bernard Riemann when he talked about a thought object. Okay, that the different objects in space actually form something greater than themselves, which we call a thought object. And here he says the totality must express an idea. And usually there are a number of ideas that we find in our remedies that are in the Materia Medica. It is the numerical aggregate plus the idea or plan that unites them in a special manner to give them its characteristic form. So this is very, very important, this idea of the wholeness, the totality that forms an idea that is greater than the individual parts. And as I said earlier, this is a concept which is discussed in the Parmenides dialogue by Plato. Each of the Platonic dialogues has Socrates having a discussion with either an Eleatic or a sophist about various things like virtue and love and justice. In this one here, it's specifically focusing on this idea of the whole versus the individual parts. And also we see this in classical music when Haydn introduced what was called the motive-furing principle, thorough motivic composition principle, which had caused a great renaissance and revolution in classical music, greatly influenced people like Mozart and also Beethoven, that both of whom employed this particular revolutionary principle in their string quartets. And if you want to really develop this ability to perceive the whole in our remedies, in our Materia Medica, I'm going to suggest a few musical works. First of all, the 1747 musical offering by Johann Sebastian Bach. This was the piece that he extemporized for the King of Prussia. The 1771 Opus 20 string quartets. These are the Sun quartets, which this is before actually the introduction of the motive-furing principle, and you want to contrast the Opus 20 string quartets, the Sun quartets, with the 1781 Opus 33 string quartets, which is the Russian quartets. And if you you compare these two together next to each other, you will see the difference. There's a uniform wholeness in the Opus 33 string quartets, which is absent in the Opus 20 string quartets. I can't explain this exactly intellectually to you. You have to actually experience this for yourself. So you have to go through and listen to these pieces repeatedly, and then you will understand what this concept of wholeness in all of life and in our Materia Medica actually represents. And then I would highly recommend the 1782 Haydn string quartets by Mozart. They're called the Haydn string quartets because they were actually dedicated to Haydn. Actually, Mozart played them with Haydn in the audience and his father Leopold in the audience. And at the end of the concert, Haydn was one of the great composers of all time. Haydn turned to Mozart's father and said, "Your son is the greatest composer known to me in person or by name." In other words, the greatest composer who ever lived, because he was able to take this motive-furing principle and basically create these incredible string quartets, these 6 amazing pieces of music. And then Beethoven further elaborated on these in his late string quartets, which actually wouldn't have even existed without homeopathy, because he had a very serious gastrointestinal problem that was cured by his physician, who was practicing homeopathy, and without those we would have never had the late string quartets, which is considered by Western musicologists as the epiphany of Western classical music. So the pieces of these are very well worth listening to. I would recommend that you, if you're going to get these, that you get those by the Amadeus Quartet. And the reason for that is Norbert Brainin, who was the first violinist of the Amadeus Quartet, specifically understood this motive theory principle and actually wrote about it and even gave discourses about this particular subject in classical music. So again, you have to listen to this. It's something that's experiential, but if you do so, I believe you will have a greater understanding. It will develop a part of your brain that is not completely active at this moment, and it will facilitate and assist you in your ability, believe it or not, in your ability to study our homeopathic remedies. Wilhelm Furtwängler, the great German composer, conductor, said that we have to listen to the music found between the notes. In other words, we have to understand the relationship between the symptoms, what is found between the symptoms, how they are related to each other, what is the combination, what is that greater whole from which the individual parts creates. And that is the music between our symptoms. That is the music between the notes, as is described by Furtwängler. This is the greater understanding of our Materia Medica, and what allows us to create a real image which we can recognize in practice when that patient needing that remedy walks into our office. In Aphorism 130, which I mentioned earlier, Hahnemann, he's talking about here about provings. Hahnemann writes that if right at the outset a properly strong medicinal dose has been administered, then one has the advantage of being able to record the exact sequence of symptoms that the prover experiences and the times when each appears. This is very instructive for knowledge of the medicine's character, because the order of the initial actions and also the reciprocal actions comes to light most unambiguously. Even a very moderate dose is often sufficient for the proving if the prover is fine-feeling enough and very attentive, as much as is possible, to his condition. The duration of a medicine's action only becomes known through the comparison of several tests in which only one dose is taken. What Hahnemann is saying here, Aphorisms 105 through 145 is the section in the Organon that specifically discusses the issue of provings. And in Aphorism 130, what he's essentially saying is that the best prover is the one that responds to the very first dose, because in that prover, you not only get the proving symptoms of that substance, but you can also see the exact sequencing of the symptoms in time. Whereas if you have to repeat the dose, then it confuses this issue, and we don't know necessarily what is the actual chronology or sequencing of the symptoms in time. He's saying if the prover responds to the very first dose, we can actually understand the time sequencing of our remedies. And so he's saying this is very important. And this is what also Hering was saying earlier on, that this is very important. We have to understand the sequencing of time of our various remedies. And Hahnemann is confirming that here in Aphorism 130. Even though he broke apart the symptoms and described them in a list according to various organ and tissue systems, he's saying, but we do need to understand the chronology or time element associated with our remedies. Now, continuing in Hering's study of Materia Medica, Hering writes, yet the zoologist can at once tell a new animal when he sees it. He can instantly determine to what class it belongs and point out its particular characteristics. By merely looking at each animal, he already knows its characteristic peculiarities, or at least has no difficulty in discovering them. So what he's saying, see, Bönninghausen was an attorney, but he was also a botanist. So he was very familiar with the concept of classification. And he understood that you could, if you were a naturalist, if you were a botanist or a zoologist, you would know, if you looked at a new plant based on its morphology, based on its form, based on its characteristics, you would know basically where it would fit into the larger scheme of nature. So here we can see on the left hand, this is a kinkajou. It's kind of an unusual animal. There was actually an interesting story recently in the newspapers of this elderly woman who woke up with a kinkajou sleeping on its chest. I guess it was somebody's pet kinkajou, and these are animals that live in like the rainforest and stuff. And I guess somebody had it as a pet and escaped the person's home and found its way to this elderly woman's house and decided to take a nap on the woman's chest. And the woman woke up from her nap finding a kinkajou on her chest. She screamed. The kinkajou got freaked out and ran away and hid in the closet. And they finally called the police or the fire department. They came and they confiscated the kinkajou. I'm not sure what actually happened to that kinkajou, but in any case, if you look at this kinkajou based on certain characteristics, it's hairy, it's got certain looks. You know it's a mammal. You may or may not know based on your your knowledge of zoology, but if you had some knowledge, you might suspect it might be in the same family as raccoons, which it is actually, and so on and so forth. But you would see certain similarities, and you'd be able to group it and classify it together. And that's essentially what Hering is saying here, is that when we get a new remedy and we look at some of the symptoms, we say, oh, based on these characteristics, based on the organ and tissue affinities, based on the sensations, based on some of the modalities, we can suspect that it will have similarity to this other remedy. Let's study this in comparison with that other remedy and see how it fits in. He then goes on to say something very interesting in his article. He says that all remedies that are closely related by the source of their derivation must also be related with respect to their symptoms. All that are chemically allied must be so medicinally. Those possessing similar odors, as we see in phosphorus, Arsenicum album, Allium sativa, asafoetida, and Bufo-rana, must possess resemblances in their symptoms. So what he's saying here is very interesting. He's saying that those remedies that come from a similar source must be allied, must be similar in their medicinal action. He also says those that have a similar odor also have to have similarity in their symptoms, okay? And those that are chemically allied, that have similar chemical compositions, similar alkaloids, also will be similar medicinally, okay? So this is a very interesting statement that he's making, okay? He goes on this point to say it is worthy of observation that the differences of those substances which are allied in their origin lie principally in the conditions of the symptoms, whereas those substances nearly connected by the similarity of their symptoms alone agree merely in single departments of symptoms, but in others have quite a different character and seat. So for Hering, the source and origin of the substance from which that remedy is derived will give you an indication of its medicinal properties. Now, I just want to point out that this is different, or at least somewhat different, from Hahnemann's position on this particular matter. I'm sure many of you are aware today that it's quite vogue to study remedies based on botanical groupings, to study the Solanaceae together, to study the Primuliciae together, to study the Scrophulariaceae together, to study the snakes, the Serpentis together, to study the Arania, the spiders together, to study the, so on and so forth, to study things within the context of a grouping. And we have a very famous homeopath by the name of Ernest Farrington who created his whole Materia Medica based on the study of remedies that are coming from a similar botanical or taxonomical or periodic or stage within the periodic table. Okay, so this has become very, very popular today. Hering basically supported this idea, as did other people like Farrington, Otto Lippe, at least to a certain degree they did. There were some differences as well, but to a certain degree they did do this. Okay, now this is different from what you'll find for the most part in Hahnemann, who in his very famous 1796 essay called In Search of a New Principle for Discovering the Curative Power of Drugs, when he discusses botanical families, he writes, perhaps, however, botanical affinity may allow us to infer a similarity of action. He asks the Socratic question. Maybe botanical affinity, maybe plants in the same family or botanical grouping may allow us to infer some type of similar medicinal properties, okay? And then he answers the Socratic question by saying this is far from being the case, as there are many examples of opposite or at least very different powers in one and the same family of plants, and that in most of them, And then he says, we shall take as a basis the most perfect natural system, that of Murray. And he goes on to give you 3 pages of examples of plants that are in the same botanical grouping, but which have very different and sometimes even opposite medicinal properties. Okay, now he doesn't say that there isn't any truth to this. He says that sometimes that this is not true, and therefore we have to be careful about this type of information. As a matter of fact, when he's writing about Ignatia, he says that Ignatia can have very similar properties to Nux vomica, which can be inferred from the fact that they come from the same botanical grouping. Both Ignatia and Nux vomica come from the botanical family called the Locanaceae. And so he does admit this, okay? But he says we've got to be careful about this because it's not always the case, okay? Continuing in his 1796 essay, he says, I am far from denying, however, the many important hints the natural system may afford. So he said, I'm not going to deny this. However, I'm far from denying, however, the many important hints the natural system, the botanical, zoological systems, may afford to the philosophical student of the Materia Medica, and to him who feels it is his duty to discover new medicinal agents. But these hints can only help to confirm and serve as a commentary to facts already known. What are the facts already known? Those that were generated during a proving. In aphorism 108 of the Organon, Hahnemann is very clear. He says the only reliable way to know about the medicinal property of a substance is to conduct a proving. There is no more sure, safe, reliable manner than to conduct a proving. Hahnemann's epistemology, the way by which he derives his knowledge of our medicines, is a scientific epistemology through the conducting of a proving or a test by giving the substance to an individual and looking at the response. And if you want to afterwards look at those remedies which, once we know the facts based on a proving, have similarities, and then we see that they're in the same botanical grouping, very interesting. That can confirm what we already know that we derive through the proving. But if we try to do it the other way around and try to guess based on botanical groupings or any other system of speculation, we are going to run into issues. So he says, but these hints can only help to confirm and serve as a commentary to facts already known, to symptoms already generated from a proving, or in the case of untried plants, unproven plants, when we haven't done this, they may give rise to hypothetical conjectures, which are, however, far from approaching even to probability. In other words, if you do this and you don't conduct a proving, according to Hahnemann, you are hypothesizing, speculating, you're conjecturing, and very often you will not really know what are the true symptoms based on the actual conducting of an experiment. And then finally, Hahnemann writes, though I readily admit that in general, similarity of action will be much oftener met with betwixt species of one genus than betwixt whole groups. So yes, there is more similarity in members of the same grouping. You look at the Solanaceae, you look at Belladonna, you look at Stramonium, you look at Solanum nigrum, you look at Mandragora, you can see similarities, no question about it. But then when you look at other members of the nightshade or Solanaceae like Dulcamara and Tabacum and Capsicum and some of these Solanum tuberosum and Lycopersicum, there isn't so much of a similarity. And we would know that anyway, just intuitively, because if you eat Stramonium or Belladonna or Hyoscyamus, you're going to have a psychotropic experience. They all have very similar alkaloids, hyoscyamine, daturine, atropine, but we don't find those same alkaloids in tomatoes and potatoes and eggplants. And so when we eat those, we get a very different type of response. We don't get these hallucinogenic psychotropic effects because they don't have those same alkaloids. So he says we'll have a much greater degree of probability attaching to it than one from the latter. Yet, my conviction compels me to give this warning that be the number of genera ever so many whose species resemble each other very much in their effects, the lesser number of very differently acting species should make us distrustful of this mode of drawing inferences. In the next session that we do, I'm going to actually discuss this issue in a little bit more detail and give you some very specific examples of how to use this in an intelligent way without basically throwing the baby out with the bathwater. There is a way to take this because there is some truth to this. And Hahnemann admits that there's some truth, and there's an intelligent way to use this information and to not basically allow it to guide your understanding of our remedies or your analysis of your cases, but to actually use it in an intelligent manner to really uh, have a deeper understanding of how remedies are related to each other. Okay, so that's the presentation. We've only got about 5 minutes, so I'm going to go through and answer as many questions as I possibly can. I did want to mention before I move on that there is going to be an excellent course which is starting in just 2 weeks. I cannot recommend this highly enough. It's with Dr. Marianne Ivans. I am very, very impressed with her knowledge of the treatment of disease conditions. She's been working with me on a project called Homeopathic House Call, and she's been incredibly impressive to me. So I highly, highly recommend for those of you who would like to have a deeper understanding with an extremely knowledgeable, very proficient practitioner that you consider this course, which starts on March 24th. It runs from 5 to 7 p.m. There's 6 sessions. You can actually see the bonus session here. Of course, all the sessions are recorded, and we do send out a DVD at the end of the course for people to review anytime they would like. So let me see how many questions I can get through. Oh yes, excellent bonus session with Marian Ivans. Okay, yes, she is great, absolutely. Okay, so does Radar have the capability of these affinity graphs? Uh, Actually, this is something that's not available in Radar or Radar Opus. Maybe it will be added in the future, but that's not currently available. Vermeulen's synoptic books as Vermeulen's concordant. Uh, what is the difference between Vermeulen's synoptic 1 and 2? Yes, the synoptic reference books, Vermeulen has incorporated also all of Allen's Encyclopedia Pure Materia Medica, so all the invaluable proving information. Before that, it had Hering. It had, I believe, the handbook, but it didn't have Vermeulen's all of Allen's Encyclopedia Pure Materia Medica incorporated into it. Do I prefer any specific book for comparative materia medica? There's a lot of good ones out there. You can just go through. They all have use. I actually like doing it myself and using the software programs to go through and do what I just showed you. Next week I'm going to do more on comparative materia medica, and I'll provide you with a list of books and also go through and show you exactly how to use software to achieve this purpose, because I think it's, we need to use the technology that's available to us today. I think if Hering and Hahnemann and Bönninghausen were alive today, they would have totally embraced the use of homeopathic software. What books do I recommend for finding the organs related? Yes, Synoptic, Bosier's Synoptic Key and the Vermeulen books. Okay. Some people were saying that the voice was going up and down. Sorry about that. This will be posted on our website, so if you missed it. Okay, I don't see any other questions. Let's see down here if there's any other questions. Yes, Patak has some of this information. Thank you. Okay, is there any way to know what the basic philosophical approach of your different teachers are? For example, I would want to select at this point for those teachers who have learned the sensation method, the themes of the periodic table, the sensations of the different plant groups, and can speak and integrate into their presentations. So I'm not sure if I understand the question, but if you're asking about using the sensation method, I did invite Roger Morrison to do one of the sessions. So after I complete the first 5 sessions, Dr. Roger Morrison will be doing session number 6, and he has studied extensively with Dr. Rajan Sankran, and I'm sure that he will be talking about the sensation method during that presentation. We decided to invite other speakers other than myself to do presentations, so I'll be doing some of them, and then we'll have some other perspectives as well. Let's see. And yes, he would, I imagine, would talk about the periodic table and the stages and the periods associated with that. Will I also be training us in the use of repertory? Yeah, these are free homeopathy classes, so they're basically homeopathy classes where I use the software to a lesser or greater degree in each class. The focus is mostly homeopathy, and then to use homeopathic software to support our study and practice of the great science and art of homeopathic medicine. So some sessions will be more or less for that. Which approach to studying Materia Medica is the best? Uh, for me, Hering's method, and I'll elaborate a little bit more on that when we discuss the Dunham approach. There will be sessions where I do more with McRepertory and reference works. It really will depend from session to session. Okay, so I think we're out of time. We're at 9:30, and I know it's late for people, so I don't want to go any longer. I want to thank everybody for your participation, for your excellent questions. I'll try to get to more questions in the future session. We will be continuing with the study of Materia Medica and specifically focusing on comparative Materia Medica for the next session. Again, I really want to encourage people, if you want to study with one of the, I think, one of the most proficient practitioners, you might want to look at this course on the treatment of urinary system disorders. I want to wish everybody a very good evening, and I'll look forward to our next session next month. Take care, everybody. Hope you're all doing well. Bye-bye.